Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Inside Government. Today is Tuesday, July 1st, 2014. And we have in studio a very special guest. When the Prime Minister is here, we waste no time with the introductions because time is very precious. And I'm sure that you are awaiting an earful on where we are right now, where we are heading next, and what is necessary to take this country out of the current climate. And so I welcome Prime Minister, Minister for Finance, Economic Affairs, and Social Security, Honorable Dr. Kennedy Anthony, to Inside Government.
Well, thank you so much, JD, for inviting me. You know, I can't resist your invitations. I mean, today you really trapped me, didn't you? You insisted that I come and I couldn't resist, so here I am. But it's always a pleasure to be with you to talk about the events in the government and, of course, issues at hand. So good to be here.
Prime Minister, you were out for 1 week. You were in London and you participated in a number of activities. My understanding is that this trip to London, this mission, was driven primarily by the government's desire to promote St. Lucia as an investment destination. A number of meetings were held, and coming out of your trip in London, there was some announcements made in keeping with that mission. I want to speak a little bit about your time in London, some of your engagements, and what we hope to come out of that meeting.
Well, I had an opportunity to meet several investors on an individual basis. Some of them were St. Lucia-based investors, and to share with them perspectives on the environment in the country and potential areas of investment. But most importantly, I had an evening with a number of investors, I think over 23 or 24 investors. They were from a variety of countries. Some of them were English, a couple from France, a couple from the Middle East. And generally, there were persons who were beginning to look at the Caribbean as potential jurisdictions for investment. That was a very, very important meeting because I had an opportunity to update them on the initiatives that have been undertaken here in St. Lucia. For example, the new legislation governing tourism, the Tourism Stimulus Incentives Bill, where we are now granting a maximum of 25 years concessions for new developers for a period of 5 years, I think it is. So it was really an opportunity to give them a sense of what is happening in the island and, of course, to look at new potential areas of investment. Renewable energy, that's a big issue now. There are a lot of investors on the horizon. They wanted to find out how we're approaching the whole issue of renewable energy. Then, of course, real estate, there's a huge market for real estate development. A lot of English investors are interested in knowing what is happening to the property market in St. Lucia, so I gave them new information, what we are sensing, what we see happening in the sector. Then, of course, there are some new investment areas that we have to begin to explore. The idea, for example, of medical services. I updated them on the creation of a university town in VF4 and the need for us to go into medical tourism as one potential source of investment. Very interestingly, too, there was a lot of interest in the announcement in the throne speech of economic citizenship. They wanted to find out where we were with this matter, and I had to update them and tell them we're just in the process now of trying to put a committee together to look at the issue of economic investment. But of course I had to dampen immediate enthusiasm because the government of St. Lucia has not taken a decision on this matter because we engage in consultation with the people of St. Lucia. So it was an opportunity really to showcase St. Lucia, to talk about St. Lucia, and to persuade those investors why St. Lucia was a better choice for investment. Interestingly, too, the High Commission had a gala night on the Saturday night to celebrate St. Lucia's 35th year of independence, and I really have to commend the High Commission. They did an extremely good job. It was well attended. It was packed to overflowing, and a number of investors also attended that event, which was a very good sign. So it was an opportunity to see St. Lucia at work, to see St. Lucia networking, to meet the citizens of St. Lucia, to really share with them their hopes and dreams for the country and the issues that we are facing and what we are doing about the issues we are facing. And I think that was very, very important. I spoke to several of them, and they really enjoyed the evening. So the High Commissioner and his staff and the High Commission did a fabulous job.
I want to speak a little about an announcement that was made while you
sure.
were in London, that the government of St. Lucia will seek to establishing some very special ambassadors.
Yes.
Special in many different ways, because they will have a central focus, and also they will not fit the portfolio that we currently have with our ambassadors, in that they will not be paid servants of the
Correct.
government of St. Lucia or the
Correct.
public. How will it work, and where exactly did this idea come from?
Essentially, this is nothing new, because in the past we have appointed ambassadors to positions without having to pay them any remuneration. Ambassador Gilbert Shiguri, who is our permanent representative at UNESCO, is a classic case in point. He was appointed, of course, several years ago. He served St. Lucia diligently now for many, many, many years, and he's been a wonderful friend of St. Lucia. You will also bear in mind that the last report of the Foreign Policy Review Committee, they strongly recommend that we move in the direction of appointing honorary consuls in various countries to help to galvanize investment, to maintain a presence for St. Lucia. And a lot of these consuls, some of them were, of course, appointed by the former government. We've appointed some. They are usually nationals of those countries, and they establish their own offices. They're not paid at all. We're also moving to appoint other ambassadors in a similar position as Ambassador Shakuri. All these ambassadors, of course, will have to finance their own offices, and they will have to manage their own operations. And the intention is it will not be for the government of St. Lucia to meet any of these costs, and we make that abundantly clear. Now, of course, the question is, well, what's in it for them? Why are they doing this? A lot of it sometimes is galvanized by a shared love of the country, a desire to want to assist the country. And quite a few of them do enjoy the fact that they have the status and, of course, the diplomatic privileges that go along with the status. So then they get attracted to these positions. But let me add that the offer of widening our net of ambassadors, widening our presence worldwide, has other benefits that we need to consider, apart from, of course, the fact that we don't really pay them. They're available to guide would-be visitors, would-be investors to the country, and they form a powerful network of influence for us. Now, I have to say, though, that there are aspects of it sometimes you have to be a little concerned about.
Yes.
For one thing, you have to do due diligence. You have to make sure that the persons are qualified and that the persons will serve the country well. Quite often, there's a lot of demand from individuals who express interest in these appointments. But
yes, because I have gotten a few requests since the announcement was made.
The reality is that those individuals are representing your country, and you don't want to be embarrassed in any way by the fact that they're representing your country. The second thing I want to emphasize, and very quickly, JD, is that those posts are not available to foreigners alone. They will be available to St. Lucians. Several years ago, I recall that the former Labour administration had pioneered the concept of goodwill ambassadors, meaning St. Lucians who are given diplomatic privileges to represent the country abroad and to advocate for the country abroad. So what is really happening is an effort to widen the network of our presence. Now, this is exceedingly critical at this point, given all fiscal challenges, because of the fact that we have to reduce costs as best as we can to deal with the situation that we have. But we have to be careful that we do not become so isolated because we are doing so that we do not maintain a presence in other countries. Of course, some people will argue, and it's not an argument that we should dismiss because it bothers me as well, that here we are an independent country, but we are, in a sense, making use of the services of others to exercise the sovereignty that we have. And it's always something that causes me some discomfort. But I think in this current environment that we have to look at other options to maintain a presence. And really investment is key, investment is vital. if we are to secure growth in this economy, we need investment, and for that reason, I think we have to go all out to encourage as many investors as possible.
Prime Minister, you made it very easy for me and gave me an opening when you mentioned the fiscal challenges. Very topical issue. And
these days, yes, I can understand, yeah.
And it is not limited to St. Lucia. We have the region facing a crisis. You are heading across to Antigua and Barbuda tomorrow to participate in a heads of government meeting. Undoubtedly, this situation that we are facing right now is going to be on the agenda. What are your own thoughts, your own proposals as to how we can proceed as a unit, as a bloc, to deal with the challenges that we are facing? I say so against the backdrop that attracting investment to St. Lucia will not simply be based on our own efforts. Investors would have had experiences in the region. They would scope the market, see what is happening, what is available. We have the experience of St. Kitts and Nevis, where investors had to take a haircut. Grenada would now go through the very same thing.
Yeah, the investors in Grenada, I think they have to take a 50% haircut, yes.
Yes. How do we say to investors that we are the ideal, that we are dealing with our problems, never mind the circumstances around us, we are committed to doing what it takes to get our economy back on track and to secure your investments?
That is a very complex question. And I think you have, in a sense, brought together two very distinct positions. And I'm going to see if I can disaggregate it or pull apart your intro before you ask the question, Jadia. First, I think you ask about the CARICOM meeting itself.
Yes.
My expectations. So
yes.
That's one.
Yes.
And then secondly, you asked about the likely impact on the interests of investors in St. Lucia, given the regional situation.
Yes.
I have to say that one of the issues that has really bothered me about the region is the failure of the region to come together to deal decisively with the economic problems that faces the region. I think the tragedy has been that virtually every country has been left alone, has had to deal with these problems alone. And I recall an initiative which I had undertaken to take up the public sector unions, encourage the public sector unions to meet with the governments at the central bank in St. Kitts. Important as I thought that was, when I look back, I wondered whether I did the right thing or whether that really had value, because I'm not too sure that our public sector unions and other officials understood what the governments are trying to say at that meeting. I don't know. I don't even know if I have the will or enthusiasm to continue that kind of dialogue at that level. But that's a different issue, and we can come back to that on a second occasion. The situation that has confronted the region is exceedingly serious, and you just take a sweep. It's like these islands have been. It's like these islands have been falling one after the other. I've had to grapple with the situation one after the other. Of course, Dominica was the first several years ago. Then Dominica was followed by Antigua. Antigua followed by St. Kitts. St. Kitts followed by Grenada.
Grenada now.
And of course, St. Lucia has been affected. And bear in mind, you've had a challenge in Jamaica and also in Barbados. Barbados, of course, is a very close neighbor. So it's really like a contagion, a disease that has swept the region. And the defining factor of all of this is that the governments have been compelled to deal with debt, very high debt, and the fiscal situation. And mercifully, one of the things we miss, the debt of St. Lucia is high, but nowhere as high as the debt St. Kitts had, or even Grenada has. But the problem is that we have a serious fiscal deficit like they have. And deficit and debts, as you know, walk hand in hand. But overall, I have been very unhappy with the failure of the region to come up with a coherent plan for the region as a whole. And there's been a failure to grasp the enormity of this problem. Because quite apart from the crisis you have in borrowing, you also have a situation that demand for the goods you produce in the region has fallen drastically. For example, because of the problems of the Barbados economy, because of the contraction that Barbados had to endure, it means that we can't sell our products from St. Lucia as much as we wanted to in Barbados. Likewise, because of the contraction here in St. Lucia, Barbados as a traditional supplier, and Trinidad as a traditional supplier, they are not getting the kind of orders they would have got in the past because of the slackening of demand here in St. Lucia. So, whereas we are all tied together, the reality is that this is a regional economic crisis, not even just a St. Lucia crisis or Grenada crisis or St. Kitts crisis. And that is why I've always said to St. Lucians that because of the fact that we are the leading economy in the OECS, we really have a special responsibility to deal with our problems. So that's a first reaction to that first question. And I'm sorry I'm taking some time, Julia, but I think
Understood.
I think it's important. The question then is, how do investors look at us? We are being observed very, very closely across the region. Institutional investors, meaning institutions we have borrowed money from, financiers, banks, they are looking at us because we have a huge sum of money that becomes due this year, several $100 million. And the question for them is, can they trust the St. Lucian economy to roll over what they have lent us? Because there's something called rolling over debts, meaning that when a bank or a financier invests in your country, they normally do so for a specific number of years. It may be 3 years, it may be 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, after you have paid them interest on the principal, then the expectation is that they will renew the sum they have lent you to earn additional interest. But the question is, will they now do so? For 2 reasons. One, what is happening in the wider region, first of all, because of this problem of haircuts. And if, of course, investors have got a haircut in St. Kitts, they've got a haircut in Grenada, then they're going to be wondering, well, what's going to happen in St. Lucia?
What's next?
Are we going to be invited to take a haircut? So these are the kinds of issues that that you have. So really, a lot of these regional investors, and this is a difference about St. Lucia that people don't understand. Most of the money we have borrowed have come from the region, not really in St. Lucia itself. We haven't borrowed heavily from banks in St. Lucia. We borrowed heavily from the region in what you call the regional government securities market in particular. So they're watching us to see how we're going to be handling the issues of our fiscal deficit. Obviously, they are very pleased that St. Lucia has been able to reduce its fiscal deficit from 9.6 to 5.6. But the question for them is, does the government and people of St. Lucia have the strength, the courage to take the extra steps to reduce that deficit below 4% of GDP? So they're watching us closely, very nervously, and that is why it is so very important that we are able to handle this successfully and handle it the right way. And that is why I believe that if, of course, we can secure consensus from all the parties, we can agree to speak from the same page, that there is evidence in the region that, look, the entire public of St. Lucia is behind the adjustments we are making. I think we will send a powerful message to the regional community and to the investor community. Now, that is for the region, Julia. There's a third component. My sense is that investors are beginning to look at St. Lucia. That is to say, those investors who want to invest in tourism, who want to invest in let us say, manufacturing and services, they're beginning to look at St. Lucia again. Because we have been able to deal with some of the inherited problems that we have. A lot of people don't know that when we got into office, there were about 3 hotel properties that were in the hands of receivers. All 3 have now emerged out of receivers. I'm talking about Capella in Marigot. You now have St. Jane's Club at Chuck. That was sold to a new owner. And I'm very happy to tell you that an agreement to settle the outstanding issues with the landings has been signed. That was signed last week. There's one other hotel, and we are now in very delicate discussions with them. That one went into receivership after we got into office, just after we got into office. And all the signs are that it's going to come out. We're going to get a very interesting buyer that will have great benefit, especially to our marketing efforts. So those investors, I think, who are looking at St. Lucia for investment in the tourism sector, they are beginning to become excited by what they're seeing. especially with the new legislation we have enacted.
I see too, Prime Minister, your own excitement as you speak of the developments within the private sector. But we have a very big problem, and that problem lies within the public sector. Government obligations, government expenditure. We have looked at the general economic situation in the region. We have been hearing the reactions from different quarters in St. Lucia,
Sure.
the public sector unions, members from the public, and so on. Do you sense that there is a lot of anxiety among the region, the regional leaders, the institutions as to what is next for St. Lucia? Do you believe that a lot is tied into our own performance as it relates to the performance of the economy, the economies of the region, our shared investments and interests such as the central bank and so on?
The answer is yes. And as you know, I'm off tomorrow to the heads of government meeting in Antigua. I am certain that my colleague prime ministers would want to ask me questions, how we are doing, how we are dealing with the situation. They're watching at us very, very closely. They're concerned. Because of the shared experiences. I mean, you have at one end, in the case of Dominica, the deceased Prime Minister Pierre Charles could not get consensus with his trade unions in Dominica, and he decided to enact legislation to authorize reduction of salaries. You have that example at one end. Then you've had the experience of Antigua and St. Kitts, where public sector unions basically accepted the need for some kind of adjustment. Then you have in Grenada, the government of Grenada is trying to secure an agreement with the public sector unions in Grenada to deal with their problems, because they realize if they don't deal with it now, then the consequences would be very serious for Grenada. So I believe that the public sector issues will loom large in the discussion, certainly among the OECS leaders. They are definitely looking at St. Lucia, because St. Lucia is really the linchpin of the OECS economy. You have to bear in mind that St. Lucia and Antigua are the two countries that contribute most significantly to OECS GDP. I think we have moved slightly ahead of Antigua. Therefore, to that extent, the governments would be concerned about what happens here in St. Lucia. And so that has added to our responsibility, added to our urgency. And let me say this. St. Lucia has always been a fascinating country. There's always been a lot of talk, a lot of debate, a lot of argument. And I think this is good and healthy. What has happened in the last couple of weeks has been important for this country. I mean, you can't agree with everything you hear or what people say, because obviously there are people who are going to be looking at the process through political lenses all the time. All they see is politics and nothing more. But in terms of educating people about the issues, getting them to understand.
There's a heightened awareness.
There's heightened awareness.
Yes.
And I think St. Lucians have to be congratulated on this regard.
Agreed.
I mean, when I look back, I think economic issues has now become part of the everyday conversation, of the everyday lexicon, everyday vocabulary of the people of St. Lucia. I mean, the issue of deficit and budget and capital expenditure and revenue, recurrent revenue, these things are now becoming ordinary language, which is really very good. So that even if some of the things that you hear are very unfortunate, and can't always produce a kind of response that you would like. But the fact of the matter is that this population has grown. And I think it is certainly something that politicians need to be aware of. So I think the region now is looking at the leadership that St. Lucia has provided, the maturity of the St. Lucian people, because they also know that we are a nation of people. We are a country, we have a certain morality in our approach to governance, that we tend to do things differently. And so we have to provide not only leadership in our own domestic context, but we have to provide that leadership to the rest of the region.
I will get to the issue of leadership, Prime Minister. The consultations. There are many persons who argue The Prime Minister has been in this business long enough to know that he will never get consensus on the proposal. He has identified the problem. He has discussed the problem for so long. He has identified a solution to the problem, yet he continues to engage the public sector unions, continues to engage civil society when he knows that he will not get consensus in the end. And so the Prime Minister should simply go ahead and do what he believes is in the best interest of this country. What would be your response to that?
I don't buy that logic. The fact that you may not get consensus does not mean you should not consult. Let's be very clear about that. Because the process of consultation, I am certain, will also lead you to persuade those who may have been on the margins, those who were critical, those who were skeptical. And there's a huge body of opinion outside of the traditional public sector unions and the associations. This is not an issue solely about public sector unions and associations. It is an issue about the people of St. Lucia, the island of St. Lucia. So there is value in the consultations, even if we are not able to secure agreement with the public sector unions and associations. And let us go back to the history of this matter. Remember that we started off, or the debate started off, with the current budget. You recall that the budget signaled a reduction in expenditure in public service, and everybody said, well, the Prime Minister has legislated a reduction in salaries, and I pointed out that really was not so.
Right.
And a budget is really about giving information on indicative expenditure, and at the same time authorizing expenditure, and you had a deadline to meet with prescribed by the Constitution, so you had to meet that. And then the government started this business of the consultations with the unions as it had always promised. We started off, first of all, by giving all the public sector unions and associations the data on the economy. We also invited them to give us a sense of exactly what reductions in expenditure they thought were necessary and how they would tackle the deficit. Of course, there wasn't much by way of any suggestions, except the traditional things, and we provided all the information that they have asked for. So that I'm certain that even if they believe that under no circumstances that they would accept a 5% reduction, and I understand this from a union point of view, they'll always take that kind of position, unless, of course, they have the kind of leadership that can go beyond the traditional approaches to these matters. This is a situation that calls for courage, not just by me.
But you understand
as
them
a leader.
because you were president of the
But it's also a
teachers union.
situation that calls for courage on their part to be able to, for them to summon the courage and tell their members, look, we need to assist the government to deal with the situation for the good of this country. I mean, those things may be hard to come by because some people will always argue things about procedure, method, etc. But that's besides the point. The fact is that this society has matured. And one of the things, JD, that has really, really pleased me amidst all of this has been the responses of civil society groups. We have invited several of them to the table. We have this discussion, and the responses have been encouraging, because once we gave the information to people, once they looked at the figures, they had a better sense of why it is that we had to take the steps that we are now proposing to the public at large. And I think that is very good. So the net of empathy has widened. People have a better sense of the issues. And there will always be those who will engage in political opportunism to seek to obtain political profit from what is happening. I mean, you hear the talk all the time. You promised us better days. Now look at what is happening. My response, people can't behave as if an economy stays static or things don't change. So economies grow, circumstances become different. When we got into office in 2011, who would have forecasted that a year later in 2012, that financial institutions and other investors would say, whoa, too much is happening around the region and we are nervous about investing in the region. Who would have thought that the Bank of Nova Scotia would suddenly say, well, we're not lending the public sector any money anymore because there's an issue of sovereign risk. We are not sure about the security of our debts. Now, you think you could have forecasted that in 2010, or that was clear? That was not the case. That is the same thing about 4%. When the government agreed to give the 4%, yes, I knew we had a deficit. Yes, I knew that situation was serious. Yes, I told the public sector unions that it would be unwise to give too significant increase because of those problems. But the important thing was then that we were still able to borrow, because that's what we have been doing all the time. Every time we have a major increase in salaries in the public sector, we borrow. And if you just watch what happened after the 14.5%, when you look at the financial charts and the financial information, there was a steep increase in borrowing to pay that 14.5%. That's how we have dealt with the issue. What has changed is that you can no longer borrow as you used to. So it is not helpful simply to say, well, you said that before. Yes, of course I said that before. I'm not denying I said certain things before. But the reality is that I am now dealing with a changed situation. And for my part, my approach has always been not even to lay blame or cast blame at the feet of the former government, irrespective of what we know. Because we know, for example, the 14.5% should not have been awarded. That's the reality. But it doesn't make sense to engage in political warfare over an issue like this when you're trying to bring people together, to get them to understand that we have a problem at hand, and the best way to deal with it is to deal with it on the basis of consensus.
Consensus consultation. I want to go back to the beginning of the process, when you started engaging the public sector unions to put forward the figures. And at the time, the government of St. Lucia had not decided as yet what would be the action that would be necessary to deal with it. But I recall going into the discussions with the public sector unions, the government of St. Lucia was of the view that there must be shared sacrifice. You indicated that as a result of the cuts that came in the budget prior, we had the 50% reduction in subsidies at the time. We had cuts in capital expenditure. We had significant cuts in communication, transfers, and so on. And so the private sector had to bear the brunt of these cuts that came in. And you indicated that in this proposal, as we sit to look at the wage bill, there must be shared sacrifice. And you were of the view that if at all there would be a wage cut, it would have to be from the Prime Minister all the way down.
Absolutely.
The government of St. Lucia came back with a proposal, and after engagement with the unions and the proposal, I'm not too sure from which union, the proposal now says that we will protect the public sector workers at the lower end. And so the cut is proposed from grades 4 upwards to grade 21, which would include you, your cabinet of ministers, and so on. Now we are seeing further compromise on the end of the government of St. Lucia with an agreement to activate the government negotiating team. And that, again, is a request made by the public sector unions. It seems as if the government is giving in, and the government is willing to compromise and to see things through the eyes of the union. But to some people out there seems to be no movement on the other side. And so they're basically waiting to see what is next.
Yeah. You're absolutely correct, Julia, that there has been compromise on the part of the government in its anxiety to secure consensus, to secure agreement. I remain totally committed to the idea that we can arrive at an agreement, even if there may be pitfalls in that approach. And there are some interesting pointers at the last meeting that I had with the public sector unions and associations. I have to tell you that the president of the National Workers Union played a very important role, even if I may have had disagreements with him in respect of how we thought we should proceed. But I will never forget that he said at a certain point, Prime Minister, you have to trust us. Trust the unions, that we are concerned about the situation confronting the country. He also made the point that they faced the same situation in representing workers in the private sector, that they too have had to agree to wage freezes and adjustments, and that there needs to be trust on this matter going forward. Whether, of course, others believed as passionately as he did on the issue of trust is a different matter, but I'm in no position to make judgment on these issues.
Understood.
And neither do I wish to make a judgment. I'm just saying that his words resonated. The second thing that he proposed, which I thought was very useful, and it did take a little effort to convince the other unions, he said, listen, he accepts that we have to deal with this issue immediately. The country is bleeding, and he said that we can resolve all these issues if you appoint a government negotiating team within 2 weeks. Again, we sought clarity on that issue.
So the time frame was proposed by the
yes,
unions?
Yes, we sought clarity on that issue, and I think we left the meeting, despite the fact we could not agree on the agenda question, that a time frame of 2 weeks. In fact, the president of the National Workers Union said at the meeting, as far as the NWU is concerned, we can resolve those issues in an hour and a half of negotiations.
With the GNT?
With the GNT, but they want the GNT. And so we said, fine. Where the disagreement was on the question of the agenda of the meeting, and their view was that only salaries and conditions of work should be on the agenda. I said, but that's impossible. That the government solution has made it absolutely clear we have a problem, that we have to reduce expenditure. So the issue of reduction of expenditure and also of wage reduction have to be on the agenda. Those two issues have to be on the agenda. And we disagreed with that. They wanted to make those issues incidental to the negotiating process, which clearly from the government's perspective does not make much sense because it doesn't conform with the reality of the situation that we face. Now, to return to your question, should I have confidence? The answer is yes, because the overriding principle is that we should try to arrive at consensus. But I have also made it clear that as long as we continue to wait, as long as we continue to be indecisive, so too will the bleeding of the economy. Because already we have missed the deficit targets because this process has been ongoing for the past 2 months. And we can't allow this process to continue in perpetuity. The burden is mine and the government that I lead to take the decision if no agreement can be found. But I think we owe it to the St. Lucian public to take them with us as we seek to go on that journey of finding consensus and finding an agreement. And I think one has to be patient, one has to be understanding, and it is really, as we go through that process, we're going to discover the real intentions.
Prime Minister, you use that term a lot, that the economy is bleeding. And if the economy is bleeding and we are still within the issue where there is no time frame, we do not yet know when the government negotiating team will be appointed because that is subject to the response of the public sector unions. Where really are we? Because there are some of us who really fear that this country will bleed to death and it may be too late for our own internal proposals or adjustments to take this economy where it needs to go.
The government is actively moving to secure the appointment of a chairman for the government negotiating team. In fact, today I had a meeting with one individual that we have asked to consider, and of course I'm hoping that he would agree. If he does, then we'll be able to make an announcement on that very shortly. And I want to go back to this issue of bleeding because the problem we have is a fiscal one. That is to say that we are not raising enough money to meet our commitments. That includes wages and salaries plus
interest payments
and our
transfers
debt payments,
and
etc.,
subsidies.
transfers, etc. And the more we do not resolve the issue, the more it means that we are not getting the reductions that we need for the fiscal deficit. And so the actual reduction in the deficit that we had expected to get for the year, we will not get it because we have already lost, we lost two months.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I really mean in the context of bleeding, because we have to be very careful. This economy has several actors.
Right.
The GDP of this country is shaped by what is taking place in the private sector and what is taking place in the public sector. As I have always said, the sacrifices so far have come from the private sector. It is the private sector workers who have borne the brunt of the economic contraction. A lot of them have lost their jobs. As Tara Maynard said, the president of the National Workers Union, they have entered into agreements with companies that they have never had to do before. For example, agreeing to wage freezes, etc., to be able, or even agreeing to reductions in staff complements to deal with that situation. And I believe we are beginning to see a turnaround in the private sector. As I said, investment is returning to the private sector. There's growth in the tourism sector. And I think the worst is over for them. But the problem is inside the government. The problem is with that fiscal deficit, with that issue of excessive expenditure in the public service. The problem is a recurrent deficit that we have. And that is why I am so hopeful about the future. Because if we can see the return of normalcy in the private sector, we can see new investment coming into St. Lucia because of activity by the private sector. The challenge now is to match that by dealing with those internal things, because it is the internal situation with the government's revenue deficit that will continue to encourage confidence in the management of this economy, and particularly investment by financial institutions and government instruments.
Prime Minister, there are some persons who are of the view that once the Prime Minister can ensure that the private sector is okay, once you fix the private sector, you do what is necessary to get investors to come into this country, the government will be okay, that there is no need to deal with wages and salaries.
No, that can't solve your problem. As I said earlier, JD, you have two major components of government expenditure. You have government expenditure in respect of recurrent expenditure, salaries, etc., transfers, etc. And the problem that you have is that you have a huge imbalance between what you're spending and what you're earning. Now, of course, you may have investment that will help to improve your GDP, but it doesn't follow that if your GDP improves, that automatically you're going to be able to raise the kind of money that you need to deal with the deficit that you have. What you have to is a chicken and egg. You have to deal with your deficit to be able to encourage continued investment in the country. And that is really the issue that we have now. The fact is that if you cannot convince financial institutions or investors to lend you money, then it means that your deficit is going to remain unfinanced. And this doesn't have anything to do with investment by the private sector. What they're looking at is the ability of the government to guarantee them the security of what they lend the government. That is the bottom line. That is what they're concerned about. And if they are uneasy about that, then you're going to be in trouble.
What about VAT? There is a proposal coming from the president of the CSA that the Prime Minister can just put 2% on the VAT rate and collect the money that is necessary to pay the civil servants. Is that an option? Is the government comfortable with exploring additional taxes or trying to collect more revenue from St. Lucians?
In this current environment, I don't believe that people of St. Lucia should be overtaxed. And if you watch the budget proposals very closely, you'll notice what I have in fact done is to reduce the levels of personal income tax, so that you now have to earn not just $18,000 but $21,000 and over for you to be taxed. And at the same time, I have moved to reduce the corporate tax rate from 30 to 28% because I eventually want to take it down to 25%.
Yes. There have been adjustments in the personal income tax rates as well.
And as well as that. And the intention there is to create more space in the economy. And I do not believe that the approach we should use is to increase taxation. I think that if you move in the direction imposing a 17% VAT on the population at large, it will impose additional burdens on the people of St. Lucia. But there's a more fundamental point. And this is the point I think that public officers find so hard to accept or to understand. And this is really where the mountain is to climb. The fact of the matter is that we are in this predicament because of the very generous wage increases over the last couple of years. Just bearing in mind that between 1998 and now, public officers have got an increase of 39.5%. It means that governments have been very, very generous. So that those increases are now impacting on your overall expenditure. The problem that we have is a problem of the public service. It is inside the public service. The private sector workers have made their adjustments to deal with the problem on their side. All the while that the private sector workers, the workers in our factories, in our businesses, some of whom had to be dismissed, had to be sent home, have had to bear the pain and the adjustments. Civil servants have really not been called upon to make any major sacrifices, despite the fact that the problem that we have is a problem of the public sector and inheres in the government itself. And what is happening now is that we are saying to our public officers, and this is what we mean by this shared sacrifice. Look, people in the private sector have made these adjustments. Now let us hold hands together and let us make adjustments on your side, because that's really where the problem is. The problem is because the problem has arisen because of the fairly generous increases that we have had over the years. And we need now to tackle it.
Our time is going by very quickly, and
Sure.
so we'd like to open the phone lines 452-3959. But just before we take any calls, I want to ask you a question, and it has to do with the sacrifice. While you speak to public sector workers and you are asking that they come to the table to make a sacrifice for the future of this country, many persons are asking, why is the Prime Minister taking such a huge risk? That it has to be a sacrifice for a Prime Minister, a politician, to come to public sector workers and say to them, listen, we have a situation in this country, and I believe the way we can solve this problem is by making adjustments on wages and salaries. People will be angry with you. And
They are, yeah.
when people think about the state that the country is in right now, some of them seem to react more to the solution to the problem as opposed to the problem itself. Does it worry you at all that this decision may very well cost you or your government somewhere down the line because it is a tough decision that the individual would have to make for the sake of the country?
There's no decision in my public life that has caused me as much distress, consternation, and agony as this decision. You have to bear in mind that as a former trade union leader, former president of the St. Lucia Teachers Union, and like Monroe's and others, I was in the forefront of seeking better wages and conditions for teachers. In those days, I think the efforts we made were fully justified. There is, of course, a possibility that many of these teachers who knew me then, and of course they'll be the older ones, not the newer generation in the ranks of the Teachers Union, would probably wonder why, as a Prime Minister, that I am inflicting this on them, given my past. They may well feel that I have betrayed them and I have betrayed the cause. The St. Lucia Labour Party prides itself on being a workers' party. We came out of the trade union movement. And I'm certain that others, including my own supporters, people's supporters, would be saying, well, he's betraying the finest ideas of what this party has stood for years. I'm certain that there is a lot of that. And it has not been easy because I've agonized over these issues long and hard. When, of course, we saw the first signs that the financial markets were no longer very sympathetic to our needs, it was clear that we were entering into a very difficult period. I think if there is one thing, of course, is that there's a lot of confidence in the government outside. There's a lot of confidence in the leadership of the government. We can't take it for granted. So for me, it has been a very agonizing and painful issue. And it has taken some time to arrive at this decision. Sometimes people think that politicians can make instant decisions. That's not so. That's not always the case. There are moments when you have to reflect, that you have to think. But you know what? You have to believe in what you're doing. You have to believe that what you're doing is right. If, Jadia, I fail to do what I'm required to do now and allow this economy to slide, and we fall in the hands of the IMF tomorrow, I will be ruthlessly attacked as being weak, supine, and not taking the decisions that the country needed me to take because I wanted to protect my political future. Yes, there are political costs. Yes, I believe that there may be consequences. But I tell you this, there are countries that have made adjustments like this before, that have shared the reasons why the adjustments are necessary. And the governments who have made those adjustments have survived. And I believe in the intrinsic common sense of the people of St. Lucia. I will never ever give up on them. Never, ever, ever. I believe that while they may be passionate about their support or non-support, but they can look at issues and come to a reasoned opinion. And that is, of course, one of the reasons why I have engaged in meeting civil society groups and explaining to them that perhaps when the calm comes after the storm, then objectively they will be kinder to me. But I would not want to go down in history as a Prime Minister who did not want to take the decision in the interest of his country simply because all he was interested in was maintaining his political credentials and his political support, and for him that was the most important thing. For me, the most important thing is the future of this country and the generation of young people as well as the children who have a responsibility, who will have the responsibility to protect this country as we continue on our course, the historical course that has been shaped for us.
I feel like you just opened up the window to your soul, Prime Minister. We have a caller on the line. Good afternoon, you're on the air.
Hello, Jadia.
Hello, good afternoon.
I promise never to do that, right?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Jadia, I tried to correct a radio person at lunchtime to tell him that, in fact, what he detected in your tone yesterday was not desperation, but concern. But for once, I wasn't able to get through. And now I'm going to tell you, I have even more reason to think how lucky the people you work for are, that you're worth your weight in gold. But having that on that personal note, on that personal note, you know where I stand on this whole thing. I think everybody knows where I stand on it. Still, I am very, very concerned about a number of things the Prime Minister said. Almost underscoring everything he said was that we were still able to borrow. Borrowing is our big problem, not being able to borrow. I thought that was very disturbing. Also, you and Prime Minister kept talking about seeking consensus, whether seeking it or whether it was important or not. And I don't understand consensus on what. You know, what is the consensus that people should? What are you asking people to agree with you on? The togetherness of opinion and all that. The harmony. I don't understand. The Prime Minister also said, asked the question regarding his Better Days promise and so on, which I have always regarded as campaign talk, and both sides do it. Who would have known this and who would have known that? But yet the Prime Minister is also forecasting better weather, and in the same way as he forecasted better weather, and then finally ended up saying, who would have known, who would have known? So I asked the same question. I heard a while ago, I know I'm taking liberties at the time, but please, this is the only time I'm likely to call.
Sure. I'll give you just about 1 more minute because we're getting close to the end of our program, and I would like the Prime Minister to respond to your questions.
You shouldn't have been that long, yeah, with your stuff to your Prime Minister. I know how clever you are with that kind of stuff.
The Prime Minister is enjoying this, you know, but I would really need him to respond to the questions that you're raising.
Don't take my time. I recognize the job is not easy. I heard Guy Joseph this afternoon. Whether what Guy Joseph said was true or not, and whether there is a response to what he said from your side, all of that at this time sounds so irrelevant to me. Absolutely irrelevant. We are in a deep hole dug by prime ministers from day one. I wish we'd get consensus on that in terms of, as far as the officials are concerned. Yeah, we are in trouble. Whoever contributed what and how much is at this point irrelevant. Absolutely irrelevant. We are in trouble, and we either decide if we can believe in the offered remedies, do we put our heads together and get to work on that? This is the kind of, I suppose, this is the kind of speech I would like to hear. An admission that we are in this hole because everybody contributed. I mean, the storms we had, people treated in a certain way. Everybody brought in their own consultants, JD and everything else. But this has been going on.
Are you calling me a consultant, Rick?
Well, it depends how much you have to pay me. You have no money.
But thank you for that. I will give.
I'm serious. We have the Prime Minister said a while ago that he's encouraged by this thing of people talking about fiscal. People are not talking about fiscal deficits. People are talking about being broke, Mr. Prime Minister. People are talking about not being able to feed their kids. People are seeing suicides and associating those suicides automatically with not being able to make ends meet. So people are not discussing fiscal deficits and all this, which is a political thing and being twisted around. People are concerned for their jobs. The private sector, it was nice to hear the Prime Minister finally talking at length about the private sector. The private sector has been taking blows left, right, and center now from Stephen King's time to now. And all of, am I being cut off?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, from Stephen King's time to now, the private sector has been saying this. We've had to let people go who've been working with companies 30 years, and their children are working with companies. It's been a horrific picture for the private sector that has hardly been featured at all. I always considered the public sector pampered. Some group from the CSA, last time I think it was, or whatever teachers group, actually in King's time when I was saying there should be no increases, to boycott my paper. So I have not changed my view in terms of the pampering of the public sector vis-a-vis the ignoring of the private sector. But then I have to go back and blame the bosses of the private sector for succumbing every time. And to me, they're doing that for selfish purpose, to retain their jobs, though they may not say that. I love your last question to the Prime Minister. I really wish I had more time. And
yes, but it's 3 o'clock, and
Prime Minister on this.
Yes.
But obviously, I don't. But I hope maybe the hacks will not be calling in, and there'll be no discussion of what I just said there.
This is another show. You cannot control this one, so don't tell. But don't worry. I need the Prime Minister to respond to.
Very quickly,
yes, you need to respond to the comments that he made. Why is it important that we need consensus? And he says consensus on what?
Well, no, I think it's more than that. And I don't want to be defensive at all, but sometimes I think when people pose issues, they tend to ignore a history behind those issues. I don't think it's correct to say that this is the first time or one of the few occasions I've dealt with the issue of the private sector. I think I've been making that point consistently to the public sector unions and association. I've said so publicly several times. That we have to concede that the private sector has gone through an enormously difficult period. And I'm not disagreeing with the call. I'm just saying that point has been repeatedly made. The second thing is this. The consensus that we are seeking is to agree that in the interest of the country, a 5% reduction in wages is essential, is necessary, that we have to reduce expenditure, we have to contain expenditure, and all of us are prepared to make that kind of sacrifice, and that therefore the government does not have to resort to alternative means to secure a 5% reduction. In other words, what one is saying is that we can arrive at that position by agreement, as has happened, let us say, in Jamaica or Bermuda, where the public sector unions got together with the government and then they signed a memorandum of understanding allowing for the reduction of the wages, and the government did not have, therefore, to turn to alternative measures to deal with that kind of situation. So I think that is the consensus that we are seeing, that one is seeking in this kind of situation. The caller is correct, and I don't think anybody is disputing this. I mean, with an unemployment rate of 23.5%, clearly there are a lot of people who are going through a distressing period. I don't think one is disputing that at all. The fact that the unemployment rate is not any higher is because of the measures the government has taken. For example, the creation of the NICE program, the interventions in the communities through the financial help we have received from the Taiwanese, etc. These things are helping, but he's right that there are families, individuals who are very concerned. And yes, some of that debate is beyond them, and they're really not interested in those issues. They're really interested in the bread and butter issues. When can I get work? When can I get a job? So this is an ongoing issue. But at the same time, to resolve issues like that, we clearly have to resolve issues of investment in the country. We have to ensure that we are able to attract new investors, and we have to ensure that in this period of difficulty that we are able to assist the most vulnerable.
The caller
I'm not
says
disagreeing
also,
on that point with
sure.
the caller.
He says also that there needs to be almost as if a historical context of what took us to where we are right now.
The caller is correct, but again, I don't want to be defensive because it is so often what politicians say are just discarded and nobody reflects on it except when, of course, it's a convenient time to do so. No, it's funny, and I can laugh at this because you yourself have drawn it to my attention that I have said repeatedly, I'm not going to be attacking the opposition on this issue. I'm not going to be engaged in any blame game of blaming the opposition for where we are. I have always accepted that the policies of both governments have led to the situation that we are in. I've made the point repeatedly, for example, that both governments have borrowed very heavily over the years. I have made the point that the 14.5% increase, and I do recall the caller was opposed to that increase at the time it was granted. And for me, I don't see any value in engaging in warfare with the opposition on this issue because, I mean, how contradictory can you be that on the one hand, you are praying for consensus, but on the other hand, you're engaging in warfare? Yes, the opposition believes that this is an opportunity for them to score points. And I don't think we should be playing politics with the economy. As a matter of fact, I think if the opposition had better sense, they would endear themselves to the public more if they adopted different strategy and different tactics in this situation. But that's, as that caller who called you would have said, and I'm going to use his words, that's for another show. First things first, the government has not instituted any reduction in salaries, and the government will not be reducing salaries at the end.
Did you give an order?
I gave no such order.
Okay.
I gave no such instruction.
I just needed to clarify that.
No such order. That's an untruth. And in any event, if I did give an instruction, such an order, it would be easily known. There are no secrets in the public service.
Well, that is true.
So anybody who engages in that kind of information, I think, is really engaged in an effort to mislead public officers and to create unnecessary excitement. So that's not so. The caller makes a point about the banks. As a matter of fact, a letter will be leaving my office this evening to summon a meeting with the Bankers Association, not only to discuss the state of the economy, but to discuss such issues. I do recall in the conversations between the associations, the unions, and the government that some of them have raised this issue. What would be the response of the banks since they may have a reduction in their incomes? Now, I think that is a valid concern, valid issue.
Yes.
And then at the meeting that I'm hoping to have with the banks in the next couple of days, certainly we'd raise that with them. But I think we also have to be honest with the caller. There are some fundamental issues at stake that we need to understand. One of the challenges we have had is to explain to our people the depth of the crisis we have. Now, the caller previously, your good friend Mr. Wayne, touched on it when he was making reference to the situation with the banking sector. He touched on it. The fact of the matter is that all the banks in St. Lucia, save the Bank of Nova Scotia, has experienced losses in the past year. The other banks did well. First National did reasonably well. The loss was really basically insignificant. But the banks are going through an extraordinarily difficult period because of those losses. Now, those losses have very little to do with what has occurred in St. Lucia, but everything to do with what has occurred in the region. And the consequence of those losses for those banks is that they are now taking extraordinary measures at their end to see if they can return to profit levels, because let's not forget that banks are holding money and trust for persons, for citizens who are saving their money, saving their income. So they have to be concerned about the returns. The second thing is this. The banks are reporting that in St. Lucia, we have over $150 million held up because of the very complex laws that we have to govern the foreclosure of property. That is to say, the process by which banks can get hold of the properties that run into difficulty, run into trouble. And some of the banks are warning that because of the failure or inability to deal with those problems, that it may become more difficult to lend money to applicants in the future. So we are now trying to deal with that problem at a regional level. And then too, the banks are very concerned about the enforced savings rate that the central bank has imposed on the banks, because the banks are saying that, look, if they are not making money otherwise, and then you have a situation where they are compelled to pay savers 3%, then of course it means that they are losing their income in a period when, of course, the banks are not performing as well as they should.
But Prime Minister, it seems as if you were saying that the discussion may not necessarily go where we would want it to go. And when I say we, I mean the individual, the consumer. Because there seems to be the view that if the government is asking me to make a sacrifice to give up 5% of my salary, I want the Prime Minister to ask the bank to accept 5% less on my mortgage when the month ends. But you are now explaining that the bank too has its own challenges, and they've been going through.
While I'm responding to the caller by making the point, he's absolutely correct that we need to talk with the banks and say to the banks too that people are making adjustments, etc., and therefore to be more benign in their approach. But at the same time, I have a duty and responsibility to paint the canvas so that the person who asks a question can understand the dynamic of the issues.
Yes, that it is more complex than we would see.
It is a very complex issue right now, because the banks generally across the region are a little nervous. Now just consider what is happening. The central bank had to intervene in 2 banks in Anguilla. There's a huge hole to resolve there. And we are now working with the World Bank and International Monetary Fund to deal with that problem. You have 2 banks in Antigua that have gone under. Well, they haven't gone under completely. The central bank intervened, and those banks are now being managed by the central bank. And so you now have all these issues in the banking sector, all these problems in the banking sector. And I'm just saying to the caller that valid as his point is, that we have to now consider the wider picture. You too have a responsibility.
I think someone summarized it perfectly yesterday and said that you are not simply the Prime Minister of the public servants, but you're the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. So you must consider all sectors of the economy and the impact that it would have on them.
People sometimes believe, Jadia, that the decision is simply a one-track decision. But when you occupy the chair that I occupy, you have to see the global situation, the global picture, the global environment. And I think the toughest thing for St. Lucians is to really accept what is happening around them and to know the consequences of what is happening around them. Very few seem to understand that, look, because of these haircuts that you have had in St. Kitts, and haircuts meaning that the government has had to reduce on the value of the investments for persons who have invested in their countries. Because of those haircuts, it is having an effect in St. Lucia because institutions and others are nervous about lending in this now environment. Because of this situation, you have a decision from the Bank of Nova Scotia that their sovereign guarantees are at risk, and they're going to be cautious about lending governments and statutory boards and state agencies. It's hard for St. Lucians to accept and understand those things, but I think we have to continue to explain as best as we could.
We are way beyond our time, Prime Minister, and so I just want to apologize to our persons on the line. I know that
yes, I know they are very
they've been calling,
yes,
we have been getting messages as well, but just to advise that this program will be available on the YouTube channel. Sure.
I appreciate the fact that there might be others who want to ask me questions,
yes.
and I do enjoy the questions and contributions. Unfortunately, I have some big trips ahead of me. CARICOM tomorrow, and then, of course, back to Europe for a couple of matters next week. Maybe when I get back, we should have a session in which callers can just call without any commentary between us and explanations between us, but just a call-in program.
Definitely, I will take you up on that offer. It seemed like you are embracing this program like you embrace your own program in Viewfort in Touch, because you're suggesting that we do exactly what we do in Viewfort every week.
Yes, we do that in Viewfort, and that has paid good dividends. But I want to thank the staff of Radio St. Lucia. We
yes.
have gone way beyond the hour. They have
yes.
been very generous with us. I don't know whether Miguel is going to be happy whether his tape was exhausted because he warned us earlier on. I hope, Miguel, that your tape is fine.
He'll be okay.
I want to thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, Prime Minister. I want to thank you so much for being here as well. And I want to thank our listeners and our callers. The program will be available on the YouTube channel. So you can go there to view it. You can pose your questions there as well. And I can, of course, relate to the Prime Minister. This has been In Touch. I thank you so much for tuning in as usual.
Not In Touch, by the way. In Touch is a Viewfort
You confuse
program.
me. You see what you just did to me, Prime Minister? Inside government.
Inside government. I wouldn't have you appropriating my program in Viewfort.
Could you imagine that? I'm so sorry. This has been another edition of Inside Government. We'll be back here next week, Tuesday. We will be speaking matters related to governance as usual, and you'll be getting the opportunity to call in and to send your messages as well. Until next week, enjoy the rest of your week, and please be safe.
Thank you very much.